Okay, welcome back. We are beginning lecture 15. So we got two lectures to go. We'll finish up with Kings, and obviously, if you're watching one lecture after the other, and you just finished watching lecture 14, notice I'm wearing the same shirt because I'm recording these in the same day. So it's just several hours later. I'm recording lecture 15. Probably do lecture 16 tomorrow morning and finish this up. So just letting you know that I won't give a much introduction. We're just picking up where we left off lecture 14. We'll pick up this time with lecture 15 and beginning in 1 Kings chapter 1 verse 1. Now we're not going through in teaching in depth in Kings. Obviously, the study of the book of Kings would make a very good course. It would, you could take the entire semester very easily to look at all of the nuances and details and kind of go in depth and the structure and so forth. But what we're trying to do is just look at the overall structure, look at the theological themes and the intent of the narrator, the author, within the canonical context, to see how Kings fits within the overall biblical narrative, and that's and how it builds upon what we've already studied, and how it sets the sort of the groundwork or the stage for the narratives to follow in the rest of the Old Testament. So that's what we're doing. I regret that we're not able to get any further. In some sense, I regret we're not able to get any further along than Kings in this second course of Old Testament theology. I also regret that just because of the nature of the move and what God is doing in my personal life, it may be some time before I can finish the third part of the Old Testament theology. I think we've learned a lot together as we've progressed through. I think Kings is a good place to stop. It for now it gets us through the former prophets, through a good part of the history of Israel, and sets the groundwork and the stage for what's to come in the following narratives that we have in the Old Testament. So and the writings and the prophets and all of that. So, but with that, just let's open with a word of prayer, and let me just have a prayer for you. Again, I'm unable to see you, and just trust that the Lord is being faithful to you in your life in the same way that He's being faithful to me. So let's just go to the Lord in prayer together. Our Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this time that we can spend together, Lord. Although it's difficult that we're not physically present together, Father, and we're not studying this at the same time, at different times. And but Lord, I just thank you that you're a God who's in control of all things. Thank you that you're sovereign over everything. Thank you for technology that you've given to us and the ability that we have to communicate your message and to discuss your word, even through these videos and recordings and so forth. Well, we just thank you so much for that your word, it just remains true today, and just as it was back then when it was originally recorded. Lord, I just pray, Father, that you would guide our thoughts, guide my speech as we look at this important text together. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So picking up with last lecture 14 was really served as an introduction to Kings, just kind of give just an overview of what is going on, so we can kind of know what the narrator is trying to do. Now, when 1 Kings begins, and I'll refer to 1 Kings and 2 Kings just for the sake of being able to differentiate in our Bibles where the material is, but it's good to think of it as one book. It kind of all fits together. So sometimes I may just say the Book of Kings, and you know what I mean by that. But Israel experienced really the greatest religious, economic, political strength during the time of Solomon. And Solomon reigned somewhere between the time frame of 970 and 930 BC. So that gives you some frame of reference. Now, under David's leadership, Israel's borders were expanded. The nation's wealth had increased tremendously. So when we come into Kings, into the Book of Kings, it's really the nation is really doing well. It's as far as the strength, as far as its span of power, its borders, everything is really it's really in a good situation. The religious life in Israel has been centralized in Jerusalem. If you remember that, we talked about how David did that. The people appear to be displaying loyalty and obedience to the covenant. And as we've mentioned several times, David, of course, had his faults, and many, I say we, meaning that Christians will look back at David and we remember him for his failures. Remember him with the sin with Bathsheba and Uriah, and I believe that's his name. If I misspoke, I apologize, but I think it's his name, Bathsheba's husband, that David had killed. And we think of all of those the consequences that came about for those sinful behaviors. But in the scheme of things, when we look at David's heart and David's loyalty, and the Bible is clear that David's loyalty was always to the Lord, and there was never a time when David strayed from the Lord into idolatry or worshiping false idols or false gods. He maintained the monotheistic perspective throughout his reign and his life. So when we think of David, he really left Israel in a very, very good position, and God was gracious to him. Now of course, he had the penalty and punishment for his sins, and we read all about that in the books of Samuel. But God was gracious, and God blessed David. And we'll find in the Book of Kings, even the southern tribes, the tribe of Judah, after the kingdom is divided, the narrator compares the kings with David. So David is really the standard that the narrator recognizes. Okay, so the book opens with David as an old king. So he's nearing the end of his life, and there's the account of them finding a young girl to keep him warm, and the narrator makes a point of saying he didn't have sexual relations with her, and so he's obviously old and has lost some of his sexual prowess, we may say, or what have you. He's nearing the end of his life, and the narrator is recounting the transition of power from David to his son Solomon. Now, Solomon's claim to the throne is challenged by his brother Adonijah, if I pronounce that correctly. However, with the help of his mother, his Bathsheba, and Nathan, the prophet, Solomon is able to become king, and we read that his rule is firmly established. Now, I want to just point out that Solomon is the beneficiary of a lot of help and a lot of assistance. He if you remember, David set the plans in motion for the temple, had gathered much of the supplies, had done that, had basically expanded the borders and set up all of the political establishment and everything for his son. Everything was there for Solomon to just take over, basically. Now he did have it wasn't without his obstacles. He did have a challenge to the throne, but David left him really in a good spot. if we can say that. And then his with the help of his mother, Bathsheba, with the help of Nathan the prophet, and so forth, he becomes king. So Solomon really was the beneficiary of a lot of help and a lot of assistance. Okay, in 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 10 through 12, we read this: Then David rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David. He had reigned 40 years over Israel, 7 years in Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem. So Solomon sat on the throne of his father David, and his rule was firmly established. Okay, so Solomon finds himself with his rule established. He's ruling over all of Israel. Now, this is prior to the tribes dividing. So he's ruling over a united kingdom. Now, prior to David's death, David gives his son Solomon some advice, some sound advice, and exhorts him to keep the covenant with Yahweh. And we can see some of this, and we think in terms of a father who knows that his time on this earth is short, and he wants to give his son some advice, and that's exactly what he does. So he tells his son Solomon in chapter 2, verse 2, he says, "I am going the way of all the earth. Be strong, act like a man, and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in obedience to him, and keep his decrees and commands, his laws and regulations, as written in the law of Moses. Do this so that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you go, and that the Lord may keep his promise to me. If your descendants watch how they live, and if they walk faithfully before me with all their heart and soul, you will never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel." So David is recalling the covenant that God had made to him, in that an heir, someone from his line, his descendant, would always be on the throne. But it was all dependent upon keeping the covenant with Yahweh. And so he's advising his son Solomon that he needs to keep the covenant of God, and keep the laws, keep the regulations, keep the law of Moses, so that he can continue to prosper, and things will go well, and that he would be able to keep the throne, and that God's covenant and promise would be maintained. And so this is the encouragement, the words that David gives to his son. Now, David also gives Solomon some political advice. If you remember, and so we look at chapter 2 in verses 5 through 9. And we read this: Now you yourself know what Joab, son of Zeruiah, did to me, what he did to the commanders of Israel's armies, Abner, son of Ner, and Amasa, son of Jether. He killed them, shedding their blood in peacetime as if in battle, and with that blood he stained the belt around his waist and the sandals on his feet. Deal with him according to your wisdom, but do not let his gray head go down to the grave in peace. Now, we find later that Solomon does in fact take care of this situation. So he takes care of Joab, and we read that later on in chapter 2. And we also find that so basically David is advising Solomon to execute Joab and some others who had aided Absalom, and that's if you remember the coup against David with his son Absalom, and these are individuals that helped with that. And so David is basically advising Solomon to be careful with these in his political situations, right? So David also asks his son to reward some old friends. We see in verse 7, "But show kindness to the sons of Barzillai of Gilead, and let them be among those who eat at your table. They stood by me when I fled from your brother Absalom." So he's saying there were some that betrayed me. You need to be careful of them. And then there were some that helped me, and you need to reward them. Okay, so Solomon, he inherits this good economy. He inherits this fighting force, this system of justice, this centralized worship, all of these things. And David is giving him some advice, and we find that Solomon keeps the advice really to the letter, and that's what the rest of chapter 2 tells us about with Solomon, how Solomon's throne is established, and it starts off with Solomon. It seems as though everything is going well. I mean, First Kings really begins with David passing his throne, his reign over to Solomon. He gives Solomon some sound advice, political. He's telling him to be careful of his enemies, to reward those who are faithful to him. He's telling him to keep the covenant of God and all of these things. And Solomon inherits all of these good things. Israel's in a very good situation. And then we find that Solomon even asks for wisdom when God comes to him and says, ask what you will, basically. And Solomon in chapter 3, he looks around and he wisely determines that, how can I judge what is right and wrong among all these people? And so God not only gives him wisdom, but he gives to him wealth as well. Okay, so then we read of Solomon. We get examples of Solomon's wise ruling in chapter 3 and 4. Provides examples of Solomon's wisdom and ability to rule. First, we find that in chapter 3, I'm trying to find my notes here where I had it. In chapter 3 through 4, so first Solomon displays his wisdom by, if you remember, being able to settle the dispute between the two mothers who had the child. You remember, two mothers went to one of the children died. Let's see if I can find it here. It's 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 16 and following. We have two prostitutes. They came to the king. One said, "Pardon me, my lord, this woman I live with in the same house, and I had a baby while she was with me. The third day after my child was born, this woman also had a baby. We were alone. There was no one in the house but the two of us. And during the night, this woman's son died because she lay on him. So she got up in the middle of the night and took my son from my side while your servant, was asleep." And you remember that. And so Solomon wisely basically says, give me a sword. I'm going to cut the living child in half and give half to this mother and half to the other. And he didn't have any intentions of doing that, but it really brought out that the true mother would be willing to give up her son if it spared his life. And so the point the narrator is making is just demonstrating the wisdom that Solomon had. And so if we read in chapter 3, verse 28, when all Israel heard the verdict the king had given, they held the king in awe because they saw that he had wisdom from God to administer justice. So obviously this is just an example of Solomon's wisdom to judge. And this is what he prayed for. Remember, he wanted to know how to judge between the people that were his subjects. And this is what he prayed for. This is what God gave him. And then this is what the narrator is giving an example of. Okay. Not only that, but Solomon displayed wisdom in is seen in the ability to rule over his chief officials. And we see this in chapter 4, verses 1 through 19, where we read that King Solomon ruled over all Israel. And we list out his chief officials in chapter 4. So we have all of these chief officials that's listed out. And so we read and discover that Solomon had wisdom and ability to rule over his and to administer his kingdom. So in verse 7 of chapter 4, we read Solomon had 12 district governors all over Israel who supplied provisions for the king and the royal household. Each one had to provide supplies for 1 month in the year, and then these are their names. So Solomon not only had wisdom to judge between matters of dispute, but he also had wisdom to rule and administer justice with his or administer with his chief officials. And then we also find that Solomon was very wise when it came to commerce and trade. And so we see in verses 20 of chapter 4 and following, in particular in verse 21, we read, "And Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates River to the land of the Philistines as far as the border of Egypt." It says, "These countries brought tribute and were Solomon's subjects all his life. During Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel from Dan to Beersheba lived in safety, everyone under their own vine and under their own fig tree." So we find Solomon able to really administer commerce and trade and really to accumulate wealth. So he had wisdom in being able to really generate commerce with the other nations, to trade and so forth. And then we find that Solomon was also displayed wisdom. We see he displayed wisdom in his judicial dealings with disputes with people. He displayed wisdom in his dealing with his chief administrators. We also see that he had wisdom in commerce and trade. And then the narrator makes a point to explain that Solomon displayed wisdom with the use of his words and with history and science and proverbs and all of these things. And so we read in chapter 4, in verse 29, it says, "God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore," he says. We read in verse 32, it says that, if I can find it here, "He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He spoke about plant life from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the walls. He also spoke about animals and birds, reptiles and fish. From all nations, people came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom." Now, I don't know if you've ever encountered somebody that was well-rounded in their knowledge and ability to speak on a lot of topics. Now, I'm not speaking of someone who's just arrogant and just thinks they know a lot of things and they really are ignorant. I'm talking about someone who is very wise. Sometimes it's maybe a senior citizen, someone who's lived a long life and they've experienced a lot of things. And it seems like whatever topic you bring up, they are knowledgeable at least enough to talk about it. And I remember as when I was a pastor, many times I'd go visit some individuals, and particularly some elderly gentlemen who've lived for a long time, and they've you can ask them questions about gardening. You can ask them questions about plants and about seasons and about when's the best time to grow things and when's the best time to do this, and you can ask them the question about a car or engines or all kinds of things, and these woodworking or craftsmanship or whatever, and these individuals are just knowledgeable about all kinds of things, and maybe even politics and world affairs, and they can tell you about history and about World War II and about Vietnam, and they can tell you all of these stories. This is how Solomon was, but just multiplied, okay? That Solomon was able to speak on any number of topics, and this is what the narrator is bringing out, that he was knowledgeable about a wide range of topics. And so he could speak, it says, with very great insight and had breadth of understanding. And the people who would have encountered Solomon were in awe of his ability to speak on these subjects. And so he had great wisdom, not just arrogance or thinking that he had wisdom when he didn't, but really understood these things from this during this time period. Now, we understand that did he know as much about plant life as botanists of today? Probably not. Okay, but compared to the people of that day, his knowledge was unsurpassed. And so the narrator goes through great lengths to tell us of Solomon's wisdom and his wealth. Now, initially, it appears as though Solomon is in a position to just continue in his father's footsteps, to advance the people along living in the covenant relationship with the Lord. And there's a real opportunity here because Solomon is in a position. He has inherited a lot from his father. We read about the struggles that his father went through. I mean, if you remember in Samuel, we read about David coming to power, and you remember that Saul was in power and David came along and he was anointed to be king, but Saul was still in power. And so, and of course, David had to go through a long struggle of getting to the point where he was actually king and actually ruling and reigning. And he went through a lot of difficulties, and then he even had his son that was seeking to overthrow him and all of these kinds of things. And in contrast, that was Solomon, who just comes into the picture. He's basically has a little challenge at the beginning, but then he's given the kingship. He's given the monarchy. He comes in, everything's established for him, and all he has to do is just take it to the next level, you may say. It's kind of like, and this is in reality how we live, and all of us. We stand on the shoulders of those who've gone before us. And so even as pastors and ministers, we are beneficiaries of those who have studied and those who have gone before us and have really plowed through the trenches. And this was Solomon. He came on the scene, and he had really everything handed to him. And so we think that he prepares to build the temple, and so he has a discerning heart. He is really in a position. It seems as though that things are really going to go well for Israel. That's what it looks like from initially. Solomon builds the temple for the Lord. He says in chapter 5, in verse 4 and 5, he says, "But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side, and there is no adversary or disaster." Okay, now, Solomon is in a position to where he has no adversary, he has no disaster, there's peace on every side, nothing is going on that is threatening. And so he says, "I intend therefore to build a temple for the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord told my father David when he said, 'Your son whom I will put on the throne in your place will build the temple for my name.'" Okay, so this is what he is. This is what he's going to do. So he uses this gift of wisdom that he has in the area of administration, and he solicits help from others who are skilled in various trades to complete the task. Okay, so it says in verse 6, so give orders that cedars of Lebanon be cut for me. My men will work with yours, and I will pay you for your men. And so he's basically soliciting and paying for experts. So there's a lot of wisdom in this, right? This is how a wise person will respond. You know that you don't have all of the resources, you don't have all of the knowledge, you don't have all of the skills, so you obtain others to come in and do those things which need to be done. And so he uses his gifts in these areas to bring in skilled workforce. So he spends, the Bible tells us, he spends 7 years building the temple. And we see in chapter 6 in verse 38, it's where we read that he spent 7 years building it. But along the way, he's encouraged by the Lord. So in chapter 6, verses 11 through 13, we read that the word of the Lord came to Solomon As for this temple you are building, if you follow my decrees, observe my laws, and keep all my commands and obey them, I will fulfill through you the promise I gave to David your father, and I will live among the Israelites and will not abandon my people Israel. Okay, so now, does the Lord need a house? Well, no. We've already, he told David before, he didn't need a house, but he's telling Solomon that if you keep my commands and you obey them, you keep my covenant, then he says that I will keep my promise to David, and I will live among the Israelites, and I will not abandon my people. So basically, he will continue to dwell with the Israelites in the temple that that Solomon establishes for him. So this is a beautiful picture of God's continued presence, abiding presence with the Israelites. Okay. Now however, back in chapter 3, the narrator gives us a hint that maybe everything is not as it should be with Solomon. So if we go back to chapter 3, and particularly in verse 1, we read this. We read, Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he married his daughter. He brought her to the city of David until he finished building his palace and the temple of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. Okay, in verse 3, we read, Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the instructions given him by his father David, except that he offered sacrifices and burned incense on the high places. Okay, so there's a couple of things here that we notice about Solomon. It's telling us at this point that he was showing love for the Lord and walked according to the instructions given to him by his father David. However, we find that he made an alliance with the Pharaoh of Egypt and married a foreign woman, the daughter of Pharaoh. And we also find that, and he builds a palace for her later, after he builds the temple. And then we find also that he offered sacrifices and burnt incense on the high places. Okay, and so this was also was not according to the law that he was supposed to do. So there is a little bit of a hint that something is not perhaps as it should be, in the sense of Solomon keeping the covenant with the Lord. Okay, so after completing the temple, building the temple, then we find that Solomon spends 13 years, this is in chapter 7, he spends 13 years building a palace for himself, and he built another palace for Pharaoh's daughter, one of his many wives. Now, I don't know if there's any significance here to the time period it takes to build something, but we have 7 years building the temple. It seems like a long time from our perspective, but then he turns around and he builds his own palace he spends 13 years building it. So it must have been some massive complex or massive temple. We don't, that he built. And then he built, of course, a palace for his Pharaoh's daughter, which is one of his many wives. Now, Solomon built many buildings. We find he expanded the kingdom. However, all of this came at a cost. Okay, and this is important in understanding when we get to the divided kingdom and understanding why it divided. But Solomon conscripted laborers from among the people to do the work, and he taxed the people to pay for everything. So after this is one of those things I'd say that that I think this is true regardless of the time period. When you have particularly like a government officials or some kind of political ruling class who are reigning or ruling or exerting authority or something like this, that they don't, the only way that they obtain wealth is by taking it from those under them, their subjects. I mean, that is the only way. You think of our government. I live in the United States of America. And the government, the only way the government doesn't produce anything. It doesn't invent or design or do anything, build anything. Private industry does that. The only way that government actually obtains money is through taxation. That's it. And you think of your local government, you think of your city and your town, and that's the only way that the government and the officials obtain money is through taxation. That's the only way they're able to build things. So if you have if your town builds a massive, let's say a courthouse, it was built by the people's tax money. That's how it was built. Well, it's the same thing in Solomon's day, that he built the temple for himself, or the palace for himself. He built the palace for Pharaoh's daughter. He built all of these other buildings. He did all of this stuff. And the only way he's not out there, Solomon's not out there with bricks and mortar and building things. He has workers. And the only way that they gets built is he takes those workers from doing their other tasks. So these are the most part farmers. These are people in agriculture. They're raising sheep and stuff like that. And so he takes them from their jobs of doing that, and he puts them into the army to fight the battles, or to build and construct and things. So rather than taking care of their own affairs, they're actually working for the king. And okay, so we have to kind of keep that in mind. This is what's going on. So after Solomon's death, and if we jump forward just a little bit to, and the next chapters deal with the temple and establishing that and setting that up, bringing the ark to the temple, Solomon's prayer of dedication, all of those things. It's wonderful aspects that we should study, but just for the sake of time for this course, we're just kind of skipping through that. And I want to get to chapter 10 tells about Solomon's splendor and his meeting with the Queen of Sheba and all of those types of things. But we get over to we'll go back to chapter 11 in a second. But in chapter 12, what we see is this is after his death. So Solomon dies at the end of chapter 11, and then in chapter 12, we find that Jeroboam. Now Jeroboam was the first king of Israel, of the northern tribes. But he and the whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam and said to him, this is the son of Solomon, "Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten your harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you." So here's what they're saying. They're saying, okay, your father Solomon put a heavy yoke, a burden on us. How did you do that? Well, he did that through taxation. He did that through conscribing the people to work and to build and to do all of these projects as laborers. So they're saying that your father has put, a heavy yoke on us. Lighten the yoke. We'll still serve you. We'll still do the things that you need, but lighten this yoke, and we'll serve you, and we'll make you king, and we'll go along. Well, Rehoboam sought the advice he consulted the elders who had served his father, and they replied that as verse 7, "If today you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants." So they're saying, okay, answer them favorably. Tell them that you will lighten their yoke, lighten their burden, and they will serve you. Well, Rehoboam consults with his friends, and his friends say, no, you need to be even harsher. And so Rehoboam, when the people come back in, he says, let me see, he says, "My father," that's Solomon, "made your yoke heavy. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions." So the king did not listen to the people and so there was this is where the kingdom divided. Okay, so why did the kingdom divide? Well, there's probably a number of reasons, but one of the main ones was the burden that Solomon placed on the people to build his temples and build all of his wealth and build all of his massive infrastructure that he had, and the people were overburdened from all of the work, and so this has led to the division of the kingdom. Okay, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. Now, Solomon had also loved many foreign women. Okay, now this proved to be his primary downfall. Now, the narrator makes a point to make it clear that they, and he says in let's see, I'm trying to find where it is. It's okay, here we go. It's in chapter 11, verse 2. It says, they, these are the foreign women, were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Okay, so God had specifically told the Israelites that when they go into the land, they're not to intermarry with the foreign women. Why were they not to do this? Okay, well, because the foreign women had, the foreign wives, they had, they were from cultures and societies and nations that worshipped false deities. They worshipped idols. And so naturally, when you bring in a woman who's from a culture of worshiping false idols, she brings her idols with her. And so when she comes into your tent and you bring her in, she pulls out her idols and she begins to worship her idols and teach those things to your children, and also teach them to you and lead everybody astray. And this is why this was the danger in doing so. They were not to be intermingling and co-mingling with the other nations. Okay, so this really proved to be Solomon's downfall, and we see this in chapter 11, in verse 2, we just read. Also in verses 4 through 5, it says, as Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of David his father had been. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely as David his father had done. Okay, so where we come to in these 11 chapters that we've read so far is it started off with Solomon really inheriting a very good thing. Right? He was really in a position to take the Israelites forward in their covenant-keeping relationship with God. However, and primarily because the narrative tells us of his love for foreign women and them bringing in the idols and the idol worship and things into his midst. And let's just pause here and just say that it is very difficult to not to be influenced by those that we bring into our midst. Okay, this is why when we talk about particularly of not marrying someone that is that's unequally yoked or is not a Christian, we talk about that, or bringing in really close people that we listen to as close friends and that we take advice from, that are in our close circle. When those people do not share the same belief system and the same worldview, it is very easy to be influenced by them, because you watch how they live, how they conduct themselves, particularly if you have respect for those individuals as people, and the next thing you know, you're being led astray, or you're being very easily coerced. It's kind of like the the old explanation of how you cook a frog in a pot. That if you just throw a frog in hot boiling water, he'll jump out, and it's hard to cook him that way. Now, I've never cooked frogs, okay, but this is what I've been told. But what you do is you put him in just warm water, and you gradually turn up the heat. And as the water begins to get hotter and hotter, the frog doesn't realize that he's being boiled or cooked to death. And this is the same way that it is with those who are in our lives, that we may think with our friends or have those who influence us that there's not really an influence going on, but it's over time, it's slowly but surely our worldview begins to be shaped and formed by those that are around us. And this is what we find with Solomon, that by the time he was an older man in his old age, maybe initially when he brought his wives in and they had their idols in their bags, maybe initially it was not a temptation to Solomon, but as time went on, he began to accept those idols. He began to accept those worship practices, and began to participate himself in those worship activities. And so his heart was turned away from God. And it was a slow, I'm sure, it wasn't something he set out to do initially, but it was something that took place over time. So what we find is that even with all of this wisdom, that Solomon ultimately dies as a fool by loving foreign women and turning to their foreign gods. Okay, so even though he had all of this wisdom, even Solomon, in the end, dies really as a fool, and as one who is worshiping the false gods. Okay, now the actions and inactions of Solomon that we read about really set the stage and set the course for the narrative that follows, for everything that happens going forward. As I mentioned, Solomon's harsh treatment of the people ultimately led to the division between the tribes. Those and remember, of Judah and Benjamin, they followed David, and they followed Solomon, and then they, of course, followed Solomon's son, and that would be Rehoboam. And the remaining 10 tribes followed Jeroboam, and the fact that, and really the fact that Solomon was permitted at all to maintain his position as king throughout his life, and that his son was permitted to continue to rule, this is Rehoboam, continue to rule, is a direct result really of the Lord's grace and covenant with David. The Lord told Solomon before his death, he says in chapter 11, verses 11 through 13, this is a little further down in the chapter, we read this. So the Lord said to Solomon, since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees which I commanded you, I will certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son, yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David, my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. So we end up with Judah, and under Rehoboam, and this is what God says: for the sake of David, he is not tearing the kingdom away from Solomon during his lifetime, but he's going to take it from his son, and but he still will leave one tribe there, and this is how we end up with the divided kingdom. Now, with Solomon's decision to marry the foreign women, as we've mentioned, and worship these gods, it leads inevitably also to the nation's moral and spiritual decline, and ultimate destruction. Okay, as we go through the narrative in Kings, and we read about the ultimate moral decay and decline and destruction of both of the kingdoms as we go forward, the northern and the southern kingdoms, we find it all coming back to this really beginning here with Solomon and his decision to marry the foreign women, worship the foreign gods, and this really just multiplies itself as we go through the narrative. So the real issue going forward is an abandonment of this monotheism that the Israelites are called to adhere to. So there's an abandonment and there's an acceptance of this polytheism, of this multiple gods, and worshiping and doing all kinds of detestable worship of the gods. And it gets worse as we progress through the narrative. So the decline of Solomon's dynasty and really the division of the kingdom needs to be understood within the context of Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 through 20. I'm just going to turn back there. Deuteronomy is such an important book, and we've already mentioned this, but it really sets the stage for understanding of all of these other books in the Bible. It's really crucial. And we come to chapter 17, verses 14 through 20. What we find is the directions or directives given for the kings. The kings when they come into the land. Now, remember back here in Deuteronomy, there were no kings yet. This is before David. Okay, so the king had not even been established. There is no monarchy, but they're given the instructions back here in Deuteronomy that the kings are to follow. So naturally, David would have known about Deuteronomy, would have known about the law, and would have read it and understood what the instructions were to the kings. Solomon should have known it as well. And so all of this is within this context. So chapter 17, verses 14 through 20, just going to read that and give some idea of what we're dealing with. Read this. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. Be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your fellow Israelites. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. The Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, taken from that of the Levitical priests. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites and turn from the law to the right or to the left. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel. Okay, now this is very, very important. It's very crucial for the kings to understand this. And when we read this, some red flags ought to immediately be going off when we think of what we know about Solomon. Okay, because Solomon seems to be ignoring many of these direct commands for kings. I mean, the king was supposed to make a copy of the scroll obtained from the Levitical priests of the law. You know, it wasn't like everyone had Bibles, you know, or scrolls with the law on it. The Levitical priests had the scrolls, had the law. But in this case, the king was supposed to have his own personal copy. And the king was to read it, just like the Levitical priest. He was to read it all the days of his life. And he was to revere the Lord and follow carefully all of the words in the law and the decrees. So you get the picture of the king was supposed to operate with a guidebook, you know, a manual. He was supposed to keep the law with him and to read it daily and to make sure that he was following it to the letter. And if he did that, then he would live, and Israel would be blessed, and he would maintain his kingdom. And this is so different from all of the other kingdoms, all of the other kings in that particular in the world of that time period. When in 1 Samuel chapter 8, I think it was, when the elders first came and demanded a king, they said, we want a king like all the other nations. Well, that's what they got in Saul, but that wasn't what they were supposed to have. What they were supposed to have is a king, not like all of the other nations, different. And everything that we read here in Deuteronomy 17:14-20 is the opposite of how all of the kings behaved in that time period. So let's look at some of the things that the kings were to do. Since we're dealing with the book of Kings, which is going to talk about kings, and it starts with Solomon, let's look at some of the things that the kings were to do, and let's see how Solomon measured up to these things. Okay, well, first of all, the king, it says, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them, for the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. Okay, now, when we come to 1 Kings in chapter 4, verse 26, we're told that Solomon had 4,000 stalls for chariot horses and 12,000 horses. Okay, well, the king's not supposed to acquire great numbers of horses. Why is that? What's the deal with horses? Well, horses were for military. They had represented military might. It wasn't something that that was very practical on the farm. For example, you didn't plow with a horse. They were used by the armies, and so who was Israel to trust in? They were not to trust in horses and chariots. They were to trust in the Lord. So Israel was not to acquire great numbers of horses and place their faith and trust in horses. Okay, horses represented power and might, and Israel's might was to be in the Lord. Well, Solomon acquired a great number of horses. The narrator emphasizes this fact again in chapter 10, verses 26-29. It says, Solomon accumulated chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses, which he kept in the chariot cities, and also with him in Jerusalem. Okay, so this is one of the things the kings weren't to do, and this is one of the things that Solomon did. Second, the king must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. Well, we just read, didn't we, how Solomon loved foreign women. And it says besides Pharaoh's daughter, he had wives to Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. Okay, they were from nations from which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Nevertheless, it says that Solomon held fast in love with them. Okay, it says that he had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. Now, to be fair, well, I don't say to be fair. That sounds like I'm justifying it. I'm not doing that, but these are of royal birth. So in all likelihood, this was Solomon making treaties with all of this, with the surrounding nations. Now, he shouldn't have been doing that either, but this is the way that they, in that time period, would have made treaties with other nations. The Hittites, the Ammonites, the Sidonians, the Moabites would have, the kings of the Moabites, for example, would have given his daughter or daughters to another king to make a treaty. So now there's some relation there. There's a related by marriage. There's a connection, and so a lot of these wives were probably had to do with the political aspirations of Solomon in expanding his kingdom and expanding his influence with the other with the other nations, okay, which he wasn't supposed to be doing that either. But this is another way in which he failed to follow Deuteronomy chapter 17. Okay. Third, we see that the king, this is in Deuteronomy 17:17, and must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. Okay, why? Why is that a problem? Well, again, when you have great amount of wealth, you place your trust and you place your faith in that great amount of accumulation of wealth. This is wasn't well, Jesus, who said, it's difficult, and I'm paraphrasing, but difficult for a wealthy man to enter the kingdom of heaven, right? Because the problem is that when you have great amount of wealth, you place your faith and you place your trust in that wealth. And so the amount of wealth that Solomon accumulated was explained by the narrator, very given great detail. In chapter 10, verse 14, he says, the weight of the gold that Solomon received yearly was 666 talents, not including the revenues from merchants and traders and from the Arabian kings and the governors of the territories. Okay, now, according to the notes that I read, 666 talents of gold is about 25 tons. Okay, 25 tons of gold. I mean, just think about that for just a minute. How much gold that is? That is crazy. The amount of gold that he's accumulating, and he says that's not even all of the revenues from the merchants and traders and all of these other things. So he's just accumulating vast amounts of wealth. It says in chapter 10, verse 27, that the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones. I mean, can you imagine the silver being just as common as stones? It's just rocks that you see out in the driveway or out on the street. And that's what he had. So this again was indirectly going, and why is this a problem? We may say, well, how does the king obtain all of this wealth, all of this gold, all of this silver? Well, he extracts it from his the people that serve him, right? I mean, that's the way the king obtains money. So it's putting again the burden on the people, which ultimately led to the taxation and all of those things. The king was not to treat. The Israelites' king was not to act like the other kings of the other nations, okay? Which, in fourth, the king is to read it, or the copy of the law, all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of the law and the decrees. Okay, now the first words, or the words of the law, they are first and foremost monotheistic, repeatedly in the law. The Israelites are told they're to serve one God only, and they are to worship him at one place. Okay, the place that God will select. That's where they're to worship God. They're not to worship him at all kinds of different places. They are to have one place where they go and they worship one God. It's to be monotheistic completely. There are to be no other gods. There's no place for any other gods. And so, for example, in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 13 through 15, we read, it says, fear the Lord your God, serve him only, and take your oaths in his name. Do not follow other gods, the gods of the people around you. For the Lord your God, who is among you, is a jealous God, and his anger will burn against you, and he will destroy you from the face of the land. Okay. In Deuteronomy 12, 1 through 7, we also read, these are the decrees and laws you must be careful to follow in the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has given you to possess, as long as you live in the land. You must not worship the Lord your God in their way, but you are to seek the place the Lord your God will choose from among all your tribes to put his name there for his dwelling. Okay. To that place you must go. So there's to be one God they worship, and they're to worship him in one place. And there is a prescribed way that they're to worship him. Okay. But in 1 Kings 11, verse 5, we are told that when it comes to Solomon, his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of David his father had been. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. Now remember, we just read that he had wives of the Sidonians. He had wives of the Ammonites. Okay, and this is where those the influence of those wives came in. Now, fifth, and this is important too. In Deuteronomy 17:20, it says that the king should not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites and turn from the law to the right or to the left. So he's not to consider himself to be better than his fellow Israelites. Okay, he's to be the same. He's to be in the same boat, we may say. He served the same God. He is to lead them. He is to lead them in the covenant, but he is not to see himself as better. Now, this would be totally different than all of the other kings of the other nations who would definitely see themselves as better than their subjects. Okay, the first 11 chapters of Kings tells, all of King Solomon's worldly accomplishments. His building projects. He accumulates his wealth. There are huge differences between the governmental structure of Israel during this time and the governmental structures of our day. Okay, so it's a huge difference. However, as I mentioned, there's one aspect that hasn't changed, and that is that the government, regardless of the structure, doesn't create anything, doesn't create any wealth. They can only accumulate wealth by extracting wealth from the citizens. Now, in many cases, this is okay. I mean, we as citizens, if I'm not sure where you're listening to this from, you may not even be in the United States. I don't know, but I just use the United States as an example. Taxes are not necessarily bad if they're used properly, if they're not overly burdensome. We understand that taxes have a place. This is how we pay for things that benefit us as a society. This is how we have a police force to protect us, and we have ambulances, and we have we take care of our poor, and we do different things, and we build roads and infrastructure and things like that. So we understand there is some aspect of that is needed, but the point is that the government doesn't build or create anything. And in the same case with Solomon and the kings, he accumulated wealth, he extracted wealth from the citizens, and so as a king that was serving the Lord is in a covenant, he was not to treat himself better and be overly burdensome or put a yoke of bondage on the Israelite people. Remember, because the Lord was to be their king primarily. Well, definitely was to be their only king, and then you had an earthly king who was to facilitate this covenant relationship between the people and Yahweh. So it was to be different, but in many ways Israel became just like the nations around them. They acted in the same way. Okay. All right. Let's see what we're going to look at here. So those directives in Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 through 20, are in direct conflict with the behavior of the kings of the other nations. Okay? The other kings of the nations around them accumulated wealth, worshiped many gods, considered themselves better than their subjects, and the other kings were self-centered. They were selfish. They were harsh in dealing with the people. They're polytheistic. Israel's kings were not to be that way. Israel's kings were to be different. And we can reasonably say with confidence, I believe, that the reason for Solomon's demise and his failure in the fall of the falling of the United Kingdom and the division was a direct result of Solomon's decision to disobey these directives given in Deuteronomy 17. Had Solomon kept these directives given in Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 through 20, the directives given to kings, then things would have been drastically different, and he probably would have facilitated the advancement of this covenant relationship. But in contrast, Solomon's father, David, with all of his shortcomings, David kept the commands given to the kings. And so we ultimately read in 1 Kings 11:6, we read that Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely as David, his father, had done. Okay. Let's see, where are we here in the notes? Okay. I think I'm going to stop there. We're going to pick up with the divided kingdom, and the way we're going to progress through the lecture 16 is we're going to look at the basically each one of the kings, and we're going to see how the narrator provided his assessment of them, and give some overview of what happened, I guess we can say, or why it happened the way it did, and look at the kings. There's a lot of them. There's a lot here. We're not going to obviously look at in detail the rest of the book, the rest of the kings, but we will give sort of an overview as we get into our last lecture and finish up pointing at some things in Kings. So let's stop right there. We'll just go to the Lord in prayer, and we'll be done until next time. Heavenly Father, we just thank you once again for your grace. We thank you for loving us and caring for us the way you do. We thank you for demonstrating your faithfulness to us time and time again. We thank you for your word. We thank you just for recording these events for us and for our benefit. And Lord, help us, Father, to learn about your character, about who you are, about your nature. Help us, Father, to serve you and to have our hearts devoted to you as they ought to be. I pray for each person who's watching this video, whatever their situation is in their life right now, that you would just minister to them, that you would just meet their needs, and just Father, that you would just bless them in a special way, Father. We just thank you so much again for all you do for us, all of those things that we see and all of those things that go unnoticed. Well, we just thank you for being real and being present in our lives. We ask these things. We just give you the praise in your Son's name. Amen. Until next time, we'll talk to you later.